Hey everyone, Wes here. In this video, we're going to take a close look at using promises in JavaScript. We'll also take a look at some of the common pitfalls that you may find yourself in when using promises. So a promise in JavaScript is just an object that represents the eventual completion of some operation. So rather than represent some concrete value itself, a promise represents the eventual resolution of that value. And so at any given point in time, a promise can be in one of three different states. It can be in a pending state, in which case the operation that we're concerned with just hasn't completed yet. It can be in a resolved state, in which case the operation completed successfully, or it can be in a rejected state, in which case the operation failed. So you can kind of think of a promise in JavaScript as a bit analogous to a promise in real life. So if you were to say, hey Wes, can you make a video about Dockerizing a Node application? Rather than give you a result for that request immediately, I might instead just give you a promise that I will complete making a video about Dockerizing a Node application at some point in the future. And then you can take that promise and you can make decisions based on the fact that you have a promise that I'm going to do this at some point in the future. So you might check back eventually on that promise and see if it was resolved successfully, in which case you might watch the video and bookmark it and like and subscribe to this channel. Or you might check back and see that, hey, this is not complete and for some reason I failed to deliver on that promise. So in JavaScript, we can use promises in kind of a similar way. So they come in really handy in cases that we might want to perform some longer running asynchronous operation, like say fetching some data from an API. And in this video, we'll actually look at using node fetch and using promises in a case where we want to say make a GET request to some API to retrieve some data, and then only once we have resolved the state of that data, then we can take some further action on it. And there are cases you can imagine when we may want to make multiple function calls on data, and after each function call, we might want to act upon the result that we get in return. And with promises, we can actually chain them together using a method that we have on promises called then. And so we'll look at promise chaining. We'll also look at catching exceptions with promises using catch. And we'll look at some common pitfalls that you might find yourself in when using promise chaining. We'll also look at how to use a very useful function called promise.all, to which we can pass an iterable of functions and then execute some function only after we have a resolution for all of the functions that we pass promise.all. We'll also look at kind of an interesting and maybe less used method that we have with promises called promise.race. But first, let's look at how we can simply create a promise and put it to use. And as we work through this video, I'm going to put all the code that we work through here together up on GitHub, so I'll post a link to that in the description. And if you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below and I'll try to respond as soon as possible. So with that, let's take a closer look at promises by diving into some code. Okay, so let's define a new promise here, and we're going to call this fetch some data. So this is going to be a new promise, and the promise constructor here is going to take one argument here, which is called the executor, and it'll have two callback functions here, resolve and reject. And so what we're going to be able to do is, given some context within this promise, if everything's okay, we're going to resolve, and otherwise we're going to reject. So for the sake of simplicity here, what we're going to do is we're going to say, if not all good, we're going to do something where we reject. Otherwise, we're going to do something where we resolve. So let's define a Boolean all good here, and we'll start with all good is true. So if not all good though, we're going to reject, and we're going to pass our reject function here, error fetching data. And then if it is all good, we're going to resolve, passing an object to resolve here, with an ID of 1 and a message of nice work. Okay, so we've just defined a promise here, and it's important to know that a promise is always going to be in one of 3 states. It's either going to be pending, which means that it hasn't settled to a value yet. That's going to be how every promise begins. It could be fulfilled, which means it's settled successfully, and in that case we'd be calling resolve. Or of course it can be rejected, in which case it's settled unsuccessfully and we've called reject. So in our case, if we wanted to consume this promise, we could say fetch some data, and then we chain then onto the end of this promise, and we're going to pass a callback function here, fetch data, and we're going to console.log. In this case we'll just say then with fetch data. And if for some reason we have rejected and there's been some type of error here, then we can pass an error callback function here, and we can say, for instance, we could just console.error for now, and we could say in the catch whatever our error is. So when fetch some data is consumed, we can see that what's going to happen here is that this promise is going to, in this case, resolve, because it is all good. So if not all good, we'll get looked over, and then we'll be in our else block here where we're going to call resolve, passing it this object. So what we should expect to see here when we call .then is that we simply console.log out the then string with our fetch data. So let's give it a shot. So indeed that's what we see in our terminal. If in this case it wasn't all good, so if all good is false, then you can see what we're going to end up calling our reject function, and this is going to be invoked in catch, and so we'll actually console.error out error fetching data. So let's take a look. So indeed that's what we see. So now let's take a look at another example here. I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to take a closer look at this promise chaining idea. So we're going to create a number of different functions here that return promises, and we'll take a closer look at this promise chaining. So first let's write a function that simulates fetching some data. So we have this function fetch data that's going to return a new promise, and we're going to simulate something that takes a bit of time here with set timeout of 2 seconds. And so after 2 seconds, we'll console log out processing data complete, or maybe we can say fetching data complete. And then we're going to call resolve with another mock object here, similar to the one that we used previously, where we just have an ID and a message. So this will happen after a 2-second timeout. Then we'll have a function that parses some data. So this is just a function that takes some data and returns a promise. And here, after 2 seconds, we are going to resolve an object that has some parsed output. And in this case, our parsed output is just going to be this string into which we've interpolated the data ID and the data message. Finally, we'll have a really simple function that just echoes out some data. This is also going to return a promise, and then after 2 seconds, it's going to return, or rather it's going to console log data.parsed. All right, so let's look at chaining the promises. So what we'll do is we'll call fetch data. That's our first function that returns a promise. And then we saw how we can use then, and we're going to pass then parse data, and then we'll chain in then echo data. So we can see that each of our functions is returning a promise with these timeouts. And so after 2 seconds, our data will be fetched, and then 2 seconds later, we will parse it. And again, we're returning a promise in which we're resolving the parsed output in this case. And then after 2 seconds, we will echo out our data, again, returning a promise here within which we're using that data that this function has passed and simply logging it out to the console. Okay, so let's run this one. So here we can see after 2 seconds, we see fetching data complete, and then 2 seconds later, parsed the data for ID 1 with message nice work. So now let's think about what would happen if there was some type of error in our chain of promises here. So like, let's say that there was some error parsing the data. So we can just put some nonsense in here, like just say foo equals bar. So clearly we haven't defined bar, and what's going to happen is an error will be thrown here. But we haven't actually done anything to explicitly handle it. So let's just see what happens when we run our program now. So after 2 seconds, we fetched our data, and then we get this unhandled promise rejection warning and a reference error that bar is not defined. We also get a warning that we have an unhandled promise rejection, and this originated either by throwing inside an async function without a catch block or by rejecting a promise which was not handled with .catch. All this to say, we should terminate all of our promise chains with a catch at the very least. And in this case, let's just handle it with a console error, and let's call our file again here. So it's important to call catch here, and this will catch at any point in our promise chain. So if we were to move foo equals bar here to, let's say, an echo data, now our promise chain will run just fine until we hit echo data, in which case now we're catching that error here. Okay, so now let's look at a few examples of other ways that we can use promises. So I'm going to create a new file here. First, we'll take a look at promise.all, which is useful for aggregating the results of multiple promises, and this is going to return a single promise that fulfills when all of the promises passed to it have been fulfilled. So it's going to reject with the reason of the first promise that rejects, or with the error caught by the first argument, if that argument has caught an error inside it using try-catch or throw blocks. So let's look at a super simple example here. I'm going to define 3 constants here, P1, P2, and P3. P1 and P2 are going to be new promises that are simply going to resolve with the string hello or world after 3 or 2 seconds respectively, and constant P3 is just going to be an integer value of 1000. So now we're going to call promise.all, and we're going to pass it an array of these constants that we've defined. And so promise.all is going to return a promise itself. So let's take the result from that, and we'll console log it. And to terminate it with a catch here, we can catch an error, and just in the event that there is an error, we'll just console.error this out. Okay, so each of these will take more or less time to complete. This constant P3, which is just an integer, won't take any time, relatively speaking, to complete, but P2 will complete after a 2-second timeout, and P1 will complete after a 3-second timeout. So let's call our file. And so after everything's been completed here, we're now just returning the result, and we're console logging it out to our terminal here. So we see an array of hello world and 1000. There's another promise function here called promise.race, which is a bit different. And promise.race is going to return a promise that fulfills or rejects as soon as one of the promises in an iterable fulfills or rejects with the value or reason from that promise. So this is a bit of a strange use case, I would say, but what's going to happen here is it's going to complete whenever the first promise passed to it in this array completes, or really when any of these have a settled value. So in the case of this constant P3, which is just an integer, that's going to happen essentially immediately. And so we'll be able to console log that result out immediately. And so just to demonstrate here, I'm going to comment out promise.all, and then we'll run this again, and we can see 1000 is just settled immediately because it's just an integer here. If we were to take this out just to experiment with, we'll take P3 out, and now it's a race against P1 and P2. Here we'd expect world to be output to the terminal because it should resolve after 2 seconds, while hello takes 3. And so indeed we see world out because it's essentially a race between P1 and P2, and P2 resolves before P1. Okay, so now let's take a look at a real world example. And for this we're going to use a library called nodefetch. So I'm going to install that in this directory. And so we'll have a real world example using nodefetch, where we'll set the constant fetch equal to require nodefetch. We could also simply import fetch from nodefetch and use ES6 syntax. And now we'll have a URL where we're going to just grab a post from this JSON placeholder.typicode.com. And so this is just a sample open web API that we can use to make requests against. And so when we call fetch, this will return a promise. So let's fetch that URL. So let's define a simple function here, and we'll just say is status 200. So this will return true for some HTTP response if the status is 200, which would be like a typical success response. And if that's the case, we'll return the result. Otherwise, we will make a new error here, and we'll pass that the status text of the response. And then we'll set error.response to the response, and then we will simply throw it. Okay, and then let's do one more function here, which will just be to get the post JSON. This is just going to be, for the purposes of an example, just a simple wrapper around returning res.json itself, which returns a promise. So now up here, when we fetch, what we want to do first is check is status 200, and then we're going to get post JSON, and then just for fun, let's console.log that JSON out to our terminal. And as always, we'll catch the error if we have an error. And in this case, we'll just handle it by console erroring the error. All right, so let's run this one. So we'll just node for node fetch example.js. Oops, and it doesn't like the import syntax here, so I am going to use a require. So let's run this again. And here we can see after some time, we have fetched out to that example API, and then we have the JSON that's been actually logged out to our terminal. All right, so finally, I'm going to take a look at some common pitfalls that you may encounter when dealing with promises. So we're going to require node fetch again, and we're going to use the same URL. And in fact, we're going to use just the same functions that we had before here, except in this case, let's also create a function get title, and we'll create another function echo title. And we'll post some additional logging inside of our functions just so it's going to be easier to see each stage. We're going to make sure that the status is 200, and then we're going to get the post JSON as usual, and then we're going to get the title, and then we're going to echo that title out. So some super simple functions here. So let's look at some of the pitfalls you can fall into when using promise chaining, and I would say that this is really one of the downfalls of promise chaining, in that they can be a bit difficult to read, and if you're not careful, you can sort of nest them unnecessarily or improperly. So we're going to check status as we've done before. And then let's say we were going to take that result, and for some reason we wanted to console.log out here that we got a result. And then we weren't careful here, and we just decided to call get post JSON here without returning it. And then we called then post get title from the post. And then we called then on the outside here echo title with the title. So this is kind of a mess. I'm going to call this one bad news. So first of all, we're not returning this promise. We're also unnecessarily nesting. So we're nesting this, we have this then, and then within here we're calling get post JSON, and then still within this scope, and then we're calling .then all the way on the outside. So we're not returning, nesting, and we're also not catching. This example is pretty similar to the example that's in the MDN docs if you're interested in looking at another similar example. So I'm going to call this next one better news, terminate the chain with a catch, and we're going to flatten everything out and make sure that everything is returned appropriately. And so in this case, it's really just all that's necessary is to say fetch the URL, then check the status. Then if we still want to, there's no problem here with like if we still want to for some reason console log that we got a result, we can do that. But here, rather than just call get post JSON, if we were going to do this way for some reason, we need to make sure that we return this promise. And then we can continue to call get title and then echo title. And then we're going to terminate with an error here and handle this however we'd like. In this case, let's just console.error it out here. But in any case, this is better news anyway, because here what's going to happen is essentially this then here isn't even going to wait for this the second then here where we're calling get post JSON and get title, because we're not even returning this promise. So what's going to happen is probably we'll console.log got a result, and then echo title is going to get called, but title is going to be undefined at this point because nothing's getting returned to it. Whereas in better news, we've flattened the chain a bit here, and now we should console.log properly got a result, as well as echoing the title properly, and then we'll just end up echoing the title. So let's take a look at this. Oops, and have a typo here. Instead of check status, so I name this is status 200. Okay, so let's try this again. And so, yep, as we would expect, when we're first fetching here, what's happening is we're essentially console logging undefined, and this would be easier to see if I were just to run one of these at a time. So if you want to comment out one of them and take a look at the first one, you can see that we're getting JSON and then undefined, and so, yep, that's no good. Whereas if we were to, we can see that we're properly console logging out the title, and it's also certainly easier to read, and we're also catching in case there is some error in our promise chain. Okay, all the code for this will be in the description of this video. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at promises, some of the different ways that we can use them, and some of the common pitfalls. Thanks for watching.